Let's start with Nazi Germany, because they were absolutely obsessed with secret weapons, or Wunderwaffen. As the war turned against them, Hitler became increasingly convinced that miracle weapons would turn the tide. The Landkreuz P-1000 Ratte. First up, the Ratte, German for rat, though there was nothing small about it. This was a proposed super heavy tank that would have weighed 1,000 tons. For context, that's 5 times heavier than any tank ever built. The design called for naval gun turrets, 25 centimeters of armor, and a crew of over 20 men. It would have been 115 feet long, longer than a blue whale. The problem? It was completely impractical. It would destroy any road it drove on, couldn't cross bridges, and would be an easy target for aircraft. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, canceled it in 1943 before even a prototype was built. It was pure fantasy. The sun gun. Now this one sounds like science fiction. German scientists proposed building a giant orbital mirror, essentially a space-based weapon, that would focus sunlight to burn enemy cities or boil parts of the ocean. The concept came from physicist Hermann Oberth and was seriously studied by the German military. The V3 supergun. Unlike the V1 and V2, which did see combat, the V3 was a massive failure. This was a multi-chamber gun built into a hillside in France, designed to shell London from 95 miles away. The barrel was 430 feet long, and additional explosive charges would boost the projectile as it traveled up the barrel. The Silbervogel, Silverbird. This was a Nazi spaceplane, a rocket-powered bomber that would skip along the upper atmosphere like a stone on water, drop a bomb on New York City, and land in Japanese-controlled territory. Designed by Eugen Sanger, it was theoretically possible, but completely beyond 1940s technology. The materials needed to withstand the heat and stress didn't exist yet. After the war, both the US and Soviet Union studied the concept, but it remained a fantasy. Acoustic weapons. The Nazis experimented with sonic cannons designed to shoot sound waves that would kill or incapacitate at range. They built several prototypes using parabolic reflectors and methane gas explosions to create pressure waves. Tests supposedly killed lab animals at short range, but the weapons proved useless in combat conditions. They couldn't penetrate buildings, had extremely short range, and were impractical on a battlefield. Section 2, Japanese experiments. Japan, increasingly isolated and losing the war, also pursued unconventional weapons, though theirs often reflected their dire strategic situation. Fugo balloon bombs. Actually, this one technically worked, but failed strategically. Japan launched over 9,000 balloon bombs carrying explosives across the Pacific, hoping they'd ride the jet stream to North America. About 300 reached the US and Canada. They caused minimal damage. One killed 6 people at a picnic in Oregon, and a few started forest fires. The US government suppressed media coverage, so Japan never learned if they were effective and eventually abandoned the program. Massive effort, negligible results. I-400 submarine aircraft carriers, these were the largest submarines built during the war. Underwater aircraft carriers designed to surface, launch seaplanes to bomb the Panama Canal, then disappear. Death ray projects. Like Germany, Japan experimented with death rays, directed energy weapons using electrical discharge or microwave radiation. None of these ever progressed beyond laboratory experiments. The technology simply didn't exist to create portable, battlefield-ready directed energy weapons with 1940s technology. Earthquake bombs. Some Japanese researchers proposed creating artificial earthquakes using explosives placed along fault lines to destroy American cities on the West Coast. The plan was scientifically dubious at best and would have required delivering massive amounts of explosives to very specific locations, essentially impossible during wartime. It never moved beyond the concept stage. Section 3. British and American failures. The Allies weren't immune to wild ideas either, though they generally had better resources to test and abandon impractical concepts. Project Habakkuk. The ice aircraft carrier. This is one of the most famous failures. British inventor Geoffrey Pike proposed building aircraft carriers out of pykrete, a mixture of wood pulp and ice that's stronger than regular ice and melts slowly. The idea was to create massive, unsinkable platforms in the mid-Atlantic to provide air cover for convoys. They actually built a prototype on a lake in Canada. It worked, technically, but the project required enormous refrigeration systems, would have taken 8,000 workers and 8 months to build just one. And by the time it was seriously considered, conventional aircraft carriers and land-based long-range planes had solved the problem more practically. Churchill loved the idea initially, but it was quietly shelved in 1944. The Bat Bomb. The U.S. military developed a weapon that sounds absolutely ridiculous. Bombs carried by bats. The plan was to release thousands of bats, each carrying a small incendiary device with a timer, over Japanese cities. The bats would roost in buildings' wooden structures, the timers would trigger at dawn, and the fires would spread through Japanese cities built largely from wood and paper. Project Pigeon/Project Orcon, behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner proposed using pigeons to guide missiles. Yes, really. The pigeon would be trained to peck at an image of the target, and its pecking would adjust the missile's flight path. Skinner actually demonstrated it worked in lab conditions, but the military couldn't take seriously a weapon system dependent on bird behavior. The project was canceled, revived, then canceled again. It technically worked but was completely impractical. The Davis gun. This was a recoilless rifle that fired a projectile forward and an equal mass of counterweight backward to eliminate recoil, allowing it to be mounted on light aircraft. The British tested it during World War I and again in World War II. The problem? It was incredibly dangerous to anyone behind the gun, had limited range, and conventional weapons proved more effective. It saw extremely limited use and was abandoned. T-95 Super Heavy Tank. America's answer to German supertanks, the T-95 was a 95-ton, heavily armored tank destroyer designed to break through fortified positions. Section 4, Soviet Experiments. The Soviet Union was more secretive about its failures, but they had their share of ambitious projects that went nowhere. Tsar Tank, actually from WWII, but tested again in WWII concepts. This was a massive tricycle-style tank with two enormous, 27-foot diameter front wheels and a smaller rear wheel. It looked like something from a steampunk novel. The design was meant to cross trenches and rough terrain, but during testing, the rear wheel got stuck in soft ground. The massive vehicle was essentially immobile and became an easy target. The project was abandoned, though Soviet engineers revisited large-wheeled vehicles in World War II with similarly poor results. Antonov, a 40 flying tank. Soviet designer Oleg Antonov attempted to create a gliding tank, literally attaching wings to a T-60 light tank so it could be towed by a bomber and glide into battle. They actually tested this once. The glider wings were huge, the towing bomber couldn't maintain altitude, and the contraption had to be released prematurely. After landing, the tank could detach the wings and theoretically fight, but the concept proved completely impractical. One test, immediate cancellation. Dog mines. This is dark, but needs to be mentioned. The Soviets trained dogs to carry explosives under tanks, where the dogs would trigger the bomb. The dogs were trained using Soviet tanks, so they were conditioned to run under Soviet tanks specifically. In combat, the dogs often ran towards Soviet tanks instead of German ones, were shot before reaching targets, or were too terrified to perform. The program was mostly abandoned by 1942 after causing more problems than it solved. Katyusha failures. While the Katyusha rocket launcher was successful, the Soviets experimented with numerous rocket designs that failed. Some were too inaccurate, others too unstable, and many exploded prematurely. They pursued everything from rocket-powered aircraft to rocket artillery, too large to be practical. Most of these experiments were classified and remain lesser known, but contributed to developing the successful systems. Section 5. Why they failed and lessons. So why did all these projects fail? Several common themes emerge. Technology limitations. Many projects required materials, precision manufacturing, or scientific understanding that simply didn't exist in the 1940s. The Silverbird spaceplane needed heat-resistant materials that wouldn't be developed for decades. Resource constraints. Projects like the Ratte supertank or ice aircraft carriers would have consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere. Germany especially wasted effort on fantasy weapons, while their conventional forces lacked basic supplies. Desperation breeding. Bad ideas. As nations faced defeat, they became more willing to fund wild concepts. Japan's balloon bombs and Germany's acoustic weapons were products of desperation, not sound military thinking. Overcomplexity. The V-3 Super gun, submarine aircraft carriers, and pigeon-guided missiles were all too complex to be reliable combat weapons. Military hardware needs to be robust and simple enough for field conditions. Changing technology. By the time some projects were ready, new technology had made them obsolete. The T-95 Super Heavy tank was pointless after air power proved capable of destroying any ground target. The atomic bomb effect. Many American projects were abandoned once the Manhattan Project showed promise. Strategic reality. Some weapons that technically worked, like the balloon bombs, failed because they couldn't achieve strategic objectives. Killing 6 people in Oregon doesn't change the course of a global war. The real lesson: desperation makes bad strategy. The nations winning the war, especially the U.S., could afford to test wild ideas and abandon them quickly. The losing powers, especially Germany, wasted crucial resources on wonder weapons instead of producing proven equipment. Conclusion. These failed secret weapons tell us something important about World War II. While we remember the successful innovations, radar, jets, rockets, and nuclear weapons, the war was also filled with expensive failures that consumed resources and brilliant minds. Some were ahead of their time, like the space plane concepts that would influence Cold War programs. Others were just absurd, like training dogs to blow up your own tanks. But each represents the desperation, innovation, and sometimes delusion of nations locked in total war. They remind us that not every ambitious project succeeds, and sometimes the simplest solutions are the best. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more World War II content, and let me know in the comments which failed weapon project you found most interesting or most ridiculous. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. And I'll